Look out when he storms through. Sonic the Hedgehog. Don't doubt what he can do. Sonic the Hedgehog. Sonic, he can really move. Sonic, he's got an attitude. Sonic, he's the fastest thing alive. He's the fastest thing alive. He's the fastest thing alive.
I love this show. No, seriously, this is like my favorite cartoon of all time, with one or two small exceptions. And apparently I am not alone in my thinking either, because this show, despite the fact that it's almost 20 years old at this point, is still alive and well and has a very active fan base on the internet. The reason for this is pretty simple. It is a really, really good show. And I don't mean it's just fun or entertaining. I've covered a lot of other video game-centric shows before, and I have fully acknowledged that while I find them very fun to watch, objectively, people's opinions on them may vary. This show, on the other hand, bucks the convention of a video game-related show being bad, and is in fact a very good example of how to do something like this right. It takes its source material, it does its own thing with it, while still remaining loyal to what it was based on, and still manages to put an interesting spin on old conventions. As a matter of fact, it's actually a pretty good example of how the right creative team, given the right license, can do wonders with what could essentially have been a quick cash-in product. The show also has the distinction of being a bit of a hidden gem, as it flew way under the radar when it was first airing, but we'll get into that a little later on. For now, let's get into the story of this series and see just why so many people remember it so very fondly. The series takes a very different direction when it comes to the Sonic vs. Robotnik plotline here. Whereas in most other plotlines, Sonic is a hero trying to stop Robotnik from taking over the world and his various schemes. In this one, Robotnik has already conquered the world. In fact, he owns pretty much the entire planet, save for a few small pockets of resistance. He's turned pretty much the entire planet into his own personal mechanical nightmare, and has turned most of its population into robots through a process known as roboticization, where their flesh is turned to metal and they're made into his mindless slaves. Sonic, in this continuity, is a freedom fighter along with several other people who manage to avoid getting captured by Robotnik, and they're fighting basically a guerrilla war against him. They're never able to oppose him directly, but they always launch small strike attacks against him, trying to stop his supply lines or blow up a factory here and there, always getting in little victories to at least hinder his operations, but never able to cut the head off the beast, so to speak. Now, if that synopsis sounds at all a little bit darker than the video games or the show that was playing alongside it, Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog, which I covered last time, by the way, it's only because it was. This was a much darker and far more mature show than we were used to seeing out of Sonic the Hedgehog, or indeed any children's television programming at the time. This is another reason why the show was so widely beloved, even to this day. It was mature and serious. It took its audience seriously and did its best to address tough topics like war, loss, how you deal with things like that, and how it affects you as a person. For example, the freedom fighters did not always win. They were shown losing companions. They were shown losing possessions, losing things important to them, and being challenged to try and deal with these kinds of things, because they were essentially fighting a losing battle the entire time. Now, of course, the premise is really good, and the stories are really good, but if the characters were not written half as good as they are, they would definitely not be able to carry the weight that this series demands. And luckily, all of them are written really well. Well, most of them. Most of the time. It's complicated. Let me explain. The characters here are very well written and rather consistent, but there are also a lot of instances of depending on the writer, meaning that certain aspects of the character do change depending on who wrote the episode, and there are a few places where the characters seem like they're trying to relearn the same lesson over and over again, despite having gone through something that taught them that lesson in an earlier episode. And it's not like Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog. This series actually has a very solid sense of continuity. But it doesn't really hamper the experience, it's just something that you notice on repeated views of the show. Also, there are a few characterizations that could have been stronger. Sonic and Sally are probably the two most consistently written characters in the entire series, mostly because they are the two main characters that get the most screen time, probably outside of Robotnik as the main villain. True, there are instances where you could make arguments that Sally sort of flip-flops between being a Mary Sue and a badass normal character, but I honestly don't see it. I mean, they mostly do act for very good foils to one another, as well as being romantic interests. And oh boy, could I make an entire video about how the flame wars have erupted over Princess Sally and her characterization in both this show and the Archie comics. Seriously, in the modern Sonic fandom, Sally has to be probably the most polarizing character I have ever seen. And she's not even in the main game continuity either. She is regulated in this day and age to this show, which is about 20 years old, and the Sonic comics, where her character admittedly has gone through several shifts over its history. But the only thing that I can really say that I could complain about is the fact that the amount of Sally porn on the internet is too damn high. And I never thought I would say anything bad about the amount of porn on the internet. Well, with that pleasant image in our mind, let's move on to the secondary cast, which unfortunately never reached the apex of character growth that our main heroes do, but at the same time you do kind of get the feeling that they were mostly there just to add some variety to the cast. And to their credit, all of them get at least one moment where they do display some nice character growth, or some pretty badass moves, but the main focus of the show is always on Sonic, Sally, and Robotnik. Of course, all the secondary characters do have their own fan bases, some of them rivaling Sonic's in terms of just how large they are, like Rotor Walrus, who is their resident mechanical genius in this series. Tails is also featured, but he is much more of a background character and far more downplayed than he was in Adventures. He's much more of a typical child in this series, and really it's stated that he's far too young to be a freedom fighter. He does start to come into his own near the tail end of the second season, and writer Ben Hurst did state he did have plans to make Tails a much more active character had the series actually progressed further than the first two seasons. And then there's Antoine, who exists. I'm sorry, I don't really like him much in this series, mostly because his entire character is based around one joke, that he is a cowardly Frenchman who doesn't have the skills to back up his massive ego. And again, this is one of the travesties of not having the time to really devote some time to developing the secondary cast. Because Antoine, in the comic books at least, went through a lot of really good character arcs, but here, he is kept extremely one-dimensional for the sake of having a character that can be used as the butt of a lot of physical comedy. The saddest part of all that is the fact that Antoine here got more episodes featuring him prominently than any of the other secondary characters. And he is still extremely one-dimensional and only used as the butt of jokes. Of course, the real tragedy of this is the fact that the last character in the Freedom Fighters ensemble, Bunny Rabbit, was probably the most underutilized character of the entire bunch, but definitely had the potential to be the most interesting. She was a character who had half her body roboticized, but they never really go into that psychologically, except for maybe one instance in the entire series where it looks like she's been able to revert back to herself, but loses that ability due to faulty machinery or whatnot. Rather than giving her any real emotional moments aside from the one that I mentioned, she's mostly relegated to what would amount to an exposition machine, a character that the other characters can talk to and bounce ideas off of. Other than that, she's used as the resident badass or the damsel in distress when Sally is indisposed, but she doesn't really get that many moments to herself, which is a real tragedy because, like I said, she, out of any other secondary character, had the most potential to have stories told about her.
Thanks, Rotor, you little genius.
Now, I know it sounded like I was complaining quite a bit there, and in a way I was, but you gotta realize that the focus of the show was always on Sonic, Sally, and Robotnik, occasionally. So it does make sense that the showrunners would want to focus on that. And I actually think it's actually a pretty good testament to the writers of this show that even though they don't really give a lot of focus to the secondary cast, they gave them enough interesting personalities and enough of mystery behind them that we actually want to learn more about them. We want to figure out what makes them tick, and we want to hear their stories too. But we don't get the opportunity here, but it's nice to know that we're interested. They actually engaged us with a secondary cast. Oh, but of course one cannot discuss Sonic SatAM without discussing its fantastic villain, Dr. Robotnik. Now, as I've mentioned before, the dynamic between Sonic and Robotnik was switched up just by having Robotnik in a huge position of power in this series, but we do have to keep in mind that Robotnik throughout the entirety of the Sonic series, in most forms, has been portrayed as a pretty ineffectual and even comedic villain. So with all that in mind, exactly how did this series